The Force enters Star Wars not as a mechanic, but as an atmosphere, a quiet pressure that shapes choices before it ever moves objects, and its earliest presentation frames it as something closer to faith than fuel, an unseen current that cannot be demanded or measured, but must be listened to and trusted, which immediately places the audience in a mythic mindset rather than a tactical one. Okihomatiken of Ka on aligning the saga with spiritual epics rather than power fantasies, and establishing that meaning precedes capability in this universe. When Obi-Wan Kenobi first explains the Force, he does not describe outcomes or techniques, he describes connection and awareness, emphasizing that it surrounds and binds all living things, a phrasing deliberately abstract and almost theological, which positions the Force as something that exists independently of the user, something that cannot be owned, only aligned with, reinforcing the idea that surrender rather than domination is the first step toward harmony. This framing is echoed consistently through Jedi philosophy, where discipline is not about unlocking strength, but about restraining impulse, and where emotional regulation is treated as a moral necessity rather than a limitation, suggesting that power without wisdom is inherently destabilizing, and that the Force itself responds not to ambition, but to clarity, patience, and humility, values that mirror monastic traditions more than martial ones. Training within this system reflects that belief, as Jedi instruction focuses less on rapid mastery and more on unlearning fear and attachment, a process that is intentionally slow and often frustrating because the journey itself is the point, and because inner alignment is treated as a prerequisite for any meaningful interaction with the Force, implying that talent without discipline is not just insufficient, but actively dangerous. This is why early Force-driven victories are rarely portrayed as feats of dominance, but rather as moments of trust, where characters succeed by letting go of control instead of tightening their grip, with the most iconic example being Luke Skywalker choosing to rely on instinct rather than technology, an act framed not as bravery alone, but as faith, a leap that only works because it aligns with the narrative logic of the Force as a responsive and discerning presence. Failure within this framework is therefore spiritual before it is physical, as characters lose access to the Force not because they lack strength, but because they fall out of balance, with fear clouding perception, attachment narrowing perspective, and arrogance severing connection entirely, turning the Force from a flowing current into a silent void that reflects inner dissonance rather than external opposition. This idea reaches its clearest articulation through Yoda, whose teachings consistently dismantle the assumption that size or spectacle matters, insisting that belief defines reality, not because belief generates power directly, but because disbelief fractures alignment, creating a psychological barrier that the Force simply does not cross, reinforcing the idea that the Force is not a tool to be wielded, but a relationship to be maintained. What makes this portrayal resonant is that it introduces consequence without spectacle, where the cost of imbalance is not an explosion but isolation, not a loss of ability but a loss of harmony. And this restraint grounds the mythology, ensuring that power feels earned, fragile and conditional rather than infinite, and preserving tension without escalating scale. Within this context, the Force functions as a moral compass as much as an energy field, responding differently depending on intent and awareness, subtly rewarding selflessness and punishing ego, not through explicit judgment but through absence, creating a system where ethical failure manifests as spiritual silence rather than dramatic retaliation. This approach also reinforces the mythic tone of the saga, aligning Star Wars with ancient storytelling traditions, where magic operates according to moral logic rather than technical rules, and where heroes are defined by who they are rather than what they can do, ensuring that the Force remains a narrative expression of character rather than a substitute for it. The consistency of this depiction establishes trust between story and audience, teaching viewers how the universe works on an emotional level and inviting them to interpret success and failure through internal states rather than external metrics, which deepens engagement and encourages reflection rather than escalation. However, this delicate balance relies on restraint, and once that restraint begins to erode, the Force risks losing its symbolic weight, because its power is inseparable from its mystery, and its mystery depends on limits that are philosophical rather than mechanical, a distinction that becomes increasingly fragile as spectacle grows more demanding. As the mythology expands, the temptation to externalize the Force into visible metrics becomes harder to resist, especially when visual storytelling prioritizes immediacy, creating pressure to convert belief into ability and alignment into output, a shift that quietly transforms the Force from a presence to a resource. When that shift occurs, the Force no longer asks characters who they are, it asks only how much they feel, and that subtle change begins to undermine everything that made the concept enduring, because emotion becomes a shortcut rather than a challenge, and intensity replaces introspection as the primary driver of power. This transformation does not happen all at once, but it accelerates as narratives begin to reward emotional extremes without philosophical grounding, treating passion as amplification rather than imbalance, and severing the link between moral discipline and capability, which fundamentally alters how the Force functions within the story. At that point, the Force is no longer sacred by default. It is conditional on narrative convenience, still spoken of in reverent tones, but increasingly deployed as spectacle first and philosophy second, creating a quiet dissonance that sets the stage for a much sharper contrast in how the Force is understood and used as the saga continues. As the story drifts further from its mythic roots, the Force begins to behave less like a presence with intent and more like a switch waiting to be flipped. And this change subtly rewires the audience's expectations, because the question is no longer whether a character is ready to listen, but whether the story is ready to deliver, transforming spiritual alignment into visual payoff and internal struggle into instantaneous reward. In this newer framing, emotional intensity becomes the primary currency, with anger, fear, and desperation treated not as destabilizing forces but as accelerants, creating a logic where the louder the feeling, the larger the effect, and where discipline is no longer a safeguard but an optional flavor, which collapses the careful tension that once made the Force feel earned rather than issued. This shift is most visible when training is compressed or bypassed entirely, allowing characters to manifest advanced abilities without the years of inner refinement that once defined Jedi growth, a change that reframes mastery as innate rather than cultivated, and replaces the idea of spiritual apprenticeship with the implication that belief alone is sufficient, provided the narrative needs momentum. Characters like Rey are not undermined by this portrayal individually, but the system surrounding them is, because the Force responds to her with immediacy rather than resistance, offering validation instead of challenge, and in doing so removes the friction that once made progress meaningful, turning discovery into confirmation rather than transformation. The Force itself also loses its sense of judgment in this paradigm, as actions no longer carry metaphysical consequence beyond immediate outcome, with morally ambiguous or reckless behavior producing results indistinguishable from mindful restraint, suggesting that intent no longer shapes connection, and that the Force has stopped listening and started complying. This compliance erodes the philosophical tension between light and dark, because if power flows freely regardless of discipline, then balance becomes cosmetic rather than structural, and the distinction between harmony and excess collapses into aesthetics, with visual cues replacing ethical weight, and spectacle substituting for consequence. Even characters who are explicitly torn, such as Kylo Ren, are framed less as cautionary figures and more as power demonstrations, where inner conflict fuels ability rather than disrupting it, reversing the original logic of the Force and turning instability into an advantage instead of a warning sign. The result is a Force that behaves like a superpower system, complete with escalation, specialization, and convenient activation, where belief no longer demands surrender but merely confidence, and where the mystical language remains intact, even as the underlying mechanics drift towards something far more transactional. This transactional quality introduces tonal whiplash because the story continues to speak of balance and destiny, while depicting a Force that rewards impulse and urgency, creating a disconnect between dialogue and demonstration, and leaving the audience to reconcile a philosophy that no longer matches its own rules. When the Force stops imposing limits, it also stops creating stakes, because failure becomes temporary and growth becomes optional, and without the risk of spiritual disconnection, loss is reduced to physical setback, easily corrected by the next surge of feeling or revelation, which diminishes the emotional gravity of confrontation. This evolution also alters how legacy characters are perceived, because their sacrifices and struggles were shaped by a force that demanded patience and restraint. And when that demand is removed retroactively, their journeys risk appearing unnecessarily arduous, not because they lacked talent, but because the universe itself has changed its expectations. The irony is that this convenience-driven force is less liberating narratively, not more, because it flattens character arcs into ability curves and replaces introspection with escalation, forcing stories to chase ever larger displays rather than deeper meaning, a cycle that grows louder but not richer. Yet the concept of the Force is resilient precisely because its original framing was philosophical, not mechanical, meaning it can be recalibrated simply by restoring consequence, by reintroducing the idea that power listens as much as it acts, and that alignment is a state to be maintained rather than a switch to be thrown. Stories like Andor demonstrate that Star Wars can thrive without leaning on the Force at all, which paradoxically reinforces how special it should feel when it does appear, reminding the audience that meaning comes from restraint, not saturation, and that absence can be as powerful as presence. When the Force is treated as sacred again, it does not need to be diminished in scale. It needs to be restored in intent, allowed to resist characters who are unready, and to fall silent when misused, because that silence is what gives its voice weight when it finally responds. Ultimately, the Force works best not as a promise of what characters can do, but as a reflection of who they are becoming, and when it is allowed to judge, to withhold, and to challenge, it regains its mythic gravity, transforming spectacle back into symbolism and power back into meaning.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.